The morning light in Lyon's Croix-Rousse district had a particular quality in October of 1843, filtering through thousands of workshop windows where silk threads caught it like spider webs dusted with gold. Our weaver, let us not burden him with a name, for he could be any of the hundreds who worked these looms, rose at 5, as he had done for 20 years, his hands already flexing in anticipation of the day's labor. His mother, bent now at 62, had already started the fire. "The Ferrat workshop received new commissions yesterday," she mentioned, stirring the pot of chicory. The old woman had a talent for gathering neighborhood gossip like she once gathered silk scraps, carefully, purposefully. The weaver merely grunted, checking his tools with the methodical care of a surgeon. Each shuttle, each reed, each heddle had its place. 3 years since Catherine's death, and still he arranged everything as if she might return to help with the delicate work. His mother watched him with eyes that held their own calculations. When would he remarry? Who might be suitable? What would become of their modest workshop without an heir? Outside, the district awakened with its peculiar symphony. The clacking of looms created a rhythm that newcomers found maddening, but which had become, for those born to it, as natural as a heartbeat. The weaver descended the narrow stairs. All stairs in Croix-Rousse were narrow, built to maximize workshop space, and breathed in the morning air, heavy with the smell of sized silk and coal smoke. "You look troubled," Marie Dubois called from across the alley, her arms full of freshly laundered silk scarves. At 35, she had the practical beauty of someone who worked hard and laughed often. The weaver appreciated her directness, though his mother's meaningful glances whenever Marie appeared had taught him caution. "Jacques Ferrand has been telling everyone who will listen that the jacquard looms will replace us all within 5 years, he replied, deflecting her real question, which was always about his well-being, his loneliness, the things he wouldn't discuss. Marie snorted. "Jacques says many things. Remember when he swore the July monarchy would last forever?" She had a point. Jacques, for all his mastery at the loom, had the political acumen of a shuttle. The weaver made his way to his workshop, a journey of mere steps, but one that transformed him from man to craftsman. Here, among the silk threads and mechanical precision, he became himself. His apprentice Victor had not yet arrived. The boy, at 28 hardly a boy, but the weaver thought of him as such, had been keeping irregular hours lately. The morning progressed with the usual rhythms until 11, when footsteps on the stairs announced a visitor. Not the shuffling gait of a fellow weaver, or the quick steps of a merchant, but measured, deliberate footfalls that spoke of quality boots and time to spare. The man who entered wore the kind of coat that cost more than the weaver earned in 3 months. "Monsieur," he began, and the weaver recognized him as Comte de Montmorency's secretary. "My master requires your particular expertise." Now, the weaver had learned, through years of dealing with the wealthy, that particular expertise usually meant either impossible demands or dangerous knowledge. Still, winter was coming, and his mother needed medicine for her joints. "Continue," he said, not stopping his work. "The wealthy respected you more when you didn't grovel." "The Comte has acquired an antique loom, a family heirloom from 1720. It requires restoration and—" Here the secretary paused, choosing his words like a man selecting which rope might hang him. "There is a specific pattern that must be recreated." The weaver's hands stilled. Historical recreation was delicate work, prestigious certainly, but fraught with complications. Old patterns held secrets, trade mysteries, family symbols, sometimes things that were better left unwoven. "The compensation?" he asked, practical as always. The secretary named a sum that would keep the workshop running through winter and beyond. It would also, the weaver knew, make Jacques Ferrand writhe with envy. The thought gave him a small, private pleasure that he immediately felt guilty about. Catherine would have chided him for such pettiness, but Catherine was gone, and the living had to make their way however they could. "When?" the weaver asked. "Tomorrow, if possible. The matter is delicate." Another pause, heavy with unspoken meaning. "The Comte's daughter is to be married in the spring, and this fabric is essential to her dowry." After the secretary left, the weaver stood at his window, watching the life of the district flow below. Carts loaded with raw silk from the south, children playing between the puddles, Father Bernard making his rounds with his particular combination of spiritual comfort and neighborhood intelligence gathering. His mother appeared at his shoulder. "The Montmorency family," she mused. "I remember when the old Comte built that mansion. There were stories." She trailed off, but the weaver knew that tone. His mother collected stories like some collected coins, and she would portion them out when the time was right. That evening, as October rain began to fall, the weaver prepared his tools for the journey to the Montmorency mansion. Victor finally appeared, breathless and slightly disheveled, with apologies about family obligations that rang hollow. The weaver noticed the boy's hands trembling slightly, not from cold or exhaustion, but from something else. Fear, perhaps, or excitement of the wrong kind. The Montmorency mansion stood on the hill like a reproach to the working district below, its limestone facade unmarked by the coal dust that colored everything in Croix-Rouge. The weaver arrived at precisely 9 in the morning, his tools wrapped in oiled cloth, his best jacket brushed but still showing its age. The butler who answered the door had the peculiar talent of looking through people rather than at them, a skill the weaver suspected was taught in some secret school for domestic servants of the wealthy. Through marble hallways that echoed with absence, no children's laughter here, no comfortable chaos of living, he was led to a wing of the house that felt different, older. The air grew heavier, tinged with the smell of old wood and something else, perhaps resignation or merely neglect. The workshop, when they reached it, took his breath away. Not from beauty, but from recognition. Here was a space that had once been sacred to the craft, now turned into a museum of good intentions. The loom stood in the center like an accusation, a magnificent piece from 1720, its wood dark with age, its mechanisms frozen in time. "Ah, the craftsman!" came a voice, and Comte Henri de Montmorency entered with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his welcome anywhere. At 55, he carried his purchased nobility like an expensive coat that didn't quite fit. The weaver recognized the type. Silk merchant made good, buying his way into respectability. There was no shame in it, merely the endless human desire to climb higher, to become more than what birth had decreed. Behind him glided the Comtesse Isabelle, and here was true aristocracy, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. At 48, she possessed that particular French elegance that seemed effortless, but was actually the result of generations of training. "Monsieur," she said, and her voice carried both warmth and distance, "we are grateful you could come." The weaver approached the loom with the reverence it deserved. His fingers traced the beams, feeling for the stories wood tells to those who know how to listen. The mechanism was sound, surprisingly so. The heddles were original, the reed intact, even the shuttle boxes showed only normal wear. "You say it requires repair?" he asked, though his hands were already telling him otherwise. "Not repair," the Comtesse said carefully. "Restoration of its ability to weave one particular pattern, the Rose of Avignon." She produced a piece of fabric, perhaps a hand's width, obviously old, the silk still lustrous despite its age. The pattern was exquisite. Roses that seemed to bloom from the fabric itself, their petals created through a complex interplay of warp and weft that spoke of master craftsmanship. The weaver studied it, his mind already calculating the technical requirements. "And the loom refuses this pattern?" He kept his voice neutral, though internally he was skeptical. Looms didn't refuse anything. They were machines, obedient to the hands that worked them. "For 3 generations, the comp said, his merchant's pragmatism warring with obvious discomfort. "Whenever this pattern is attempted, the threads break, the fabric tears. Marriages in our family have—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound ridiculous in daylight. "Suffered afterwards." Now this was interesting. The weaver had heard of cursed objects, of course. Every workshop had its stories, but he had never encountered one that was so specific in its malevolence. "Show me," he said simply. They had prepared silk threads, beautiful quality, and the weaver began the careful process of warping the loom. As he worked, he became aware of being watched. A young woman had entered, 22 perhaps, with her mother's elegance, but something else too, a restlessness that fine clothes couldn't disguise. "My daughter Claudette," the Comtesse said, and there was weight in that introduction. Stories untold. Claudette studied him with intelligent eyes. "Do you believe in curses, monsieur?" she asked, and her tone suggested she was testing more than just his superstition. "I believe in cause and effect, mademoiselle," he replied, threading the heddles with practiced ease. "What appears mysterious often has explanation in the physical world." A young man's laughter, sharp and unpleasant, cut through the room. "How wonderfully modern," Etienne de Montmorency said, entering with the studied casualness of someone who wanted to appear unexpected. At 25, he had the soft look of someone who had never worked with his hands, never needed to. "Our hired man believes in science. Perhaps he can science away 3 generations of family tragedy." The weaver had met many like Etienne, younger sons with older appetites, bitter about everything, grateful for nothing. He continued his work without response, which seemed to irritate the young man more than words would have. As the loom was prepared, the weaver noticed something curious. When he pressed on certain floorboards, they gave slightly, suggesting hollow space beneath. The room itself was oddly positioned, jutting out from the main structure of the house like an afterthought. Or perhaps, he mused, like something built for a specific purpose. "I'll need to work alone," he said finally. "The process requires concentration." The family departed with varying degrees of reluctance, but not before Claudette pressed a small silk purse into his hands. "For your trouble," she said, but her eyes said something else entirely, a plea, perhaps, or a warning. Alone with the loom, the weaver began the delicate process of attempting the Rose of Avignon pattern. The first few passes of the shuttle went smoothly, the silk threads singing their familiar song. Then, as he reached the point where the rose pattern would begin its complex repeats, something changed. The threads didn't break immediately. Instead, they began to vibrate, a subtle movement that his trained fingers detected instantly. The vibration grew stronger, and then, with a sound like a sigh, 3 threads snapped simultaneously. The weaver stopped, his mind racing. This wasn't random breaking, it was systematic, predictable. He examined the broken threads, finding them severed cleanly, not frayed as would happen with excessive tension. Something was causing them to vibrate beyond their tolerance. He began again, this time paying attention to everything. The sound of the shuttle, the tension of the warp, the very air in the room. And there it was, so subtle he almost missed it. When the loom reached a certain rhythm, a certain combination of movements, the floor beneath seemed to pulse in response. 3 days had passed since the weaver's first encounter with the cursed loom, and he found himself walking the servants' corridor of the Montmorency mansion, following a housemaid who moved with the efficiency of someone who had learned to be invisible. The family had granted him freedom to investigate as needed, though Etienne had made his displeasure known through various small discourtesies. The fabric sample lay in his pocket like a question. He had spent the previous evening studying it by candlelight, his mother offering occasional commentary while she mended. The Rose of Avignon was more than decorative. It contained a language of symbols that only someone versed in the old guild traditions would recognize. Marriage knots, fertility spirals, protective wards woven into beauty. Someone had encoded wishes into silk. "Old Margot doesn't speak to many," the housemaid warned, stopping before a door in the servants' quarters. "She's 70 now. Mind isn't what it was." But when the weaver entered the small, neat room, he found eyes that were anything but vacant. Margot sat in a chair by the window, her hands still moving in the phantom motion of weaving, though they held no thread. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You've come about the loom." It wasn't a question. The weaver settled onto a stool, she indicated, noting how her room overlooked the workshop wing. She had been watching him then. "You worked it once," he said, making it a statement rather than an inquiry. 40 years ago, when I was 30 and thought myself clever." Her voice carried the musicality of the old lion accent, the one that was disappearing as the city grew modern. "The young Comte, then, Henri's father, brought me from the workshop district. I had nimble fingers," he said, "could weave anything." The weaver waited. In his experience, the old told their stories in their own time, like thread unwinding from a spool. The first Comtesse to attempt the pattern was in 1760. The loom was new then, made specially by a master in Zurich. Swiss precision, French artistry, they said. Margot's fingers twitched, remembering. She completed half before the threads began breaking. Her husband took a mistress that winter. Coincidence, perhaps, but the servants knew better. "And when you attempted it?" Her eyes grew distant. 1798. The revolution had passed, barely, and the family had returned from England. They needed to prove their French loyalty, their connection to tradition. The Rose of Avignon was to be for the young master's bride. She paused, her breath catching slightly. I was 3 days into the pattern when it began. The vibration, like the loom, was angry. The weaver leaned forward. Vibration? In the floor, in the air, in your very bones. The old Comte claimed it was the ghost of his grandfather who had commissioned the loom, but I knew better. She fixed him with those sharp eyes. You feel it too, don't you? The way the house responds to the loom's rhythm. Before he could answer, footsteps in the corridor announced a visitor. Victor appeared in the doorway, flushed and anxious. Master, I've been looking everywhere. There's a problem at the workshop. The weaver rose, but Margot caught his sleeve with surprising strength. The wine cellar, she whispered. The old wine cellar beneath the workshop. That's where the answer lies. But be careful. Some stones are better left unturned. Outside, Victor's agitation increased. It's Jacques Ferrand, he said once they were beyond the servants' quarters. He's been telling everyone you've abandoned your workshop for aristocratic pretensions. He says the Montmorency Commission is cursed, that you'll bring ruin to the district's reputation. The weaver almost smiled. Jacques' jealousy was as predictable as a shuttle's path. But there was something else in Victor's manner, a nervousness that went beyond concern for workshop politics. The boy kept glancing back at the mansion, specifically at the windows of the main floor where the family quarters lay. Victor, the weaver said carefully, is there something you need to tell me? The apprentice's face went through several expressions, guilt, fear, calculation, before settling on a forced casualness. No, master. Just concerned about the workshop's reputation. They parted at the mansion gates, Victor hurrying toward the district while the weaver remained, contemplating. He had learned to read people like he read thread tensions, and Victor was near his breaking point. But from what pressure? Returning to the workshop wing, the weaver found Claudette there, running her fingers along the loom's beams with a familiarity that surprised him. My grandmother taught me to weave when I was small, she said without preamble, before it was deemed inappropriate for a comte's daughter. She moved with purpose to a corner of the room, pressing on a section of paneling that swung open to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside were ledgers, papers yellowed with age. The family records, she said, handing them to him. My mother doesn't know I found these. The weaver opened the first ledger, dated 1760. The entries were in a careful hand, documenting silk purchases, thread counts, and then increasingly frantic notes about the loom's behavior. Third attempt failed. Threads break at the 14th rose. Marie Claire takes to her bed with nervous exhaustion. Every generation, Claudette said softly, someone tries to complete the pattern, always for a wedding, always with hope it will be different. She pulled out another paper, newer. This is why I need it completed. It was a marriage contract, but the terms were unusual. The bride's family must present the rose of Avignon fabric as part of the dowry, a tradition dating to the first Montmorency marriage into nobility. Without it, the contract could be voided. Your marriage? The weaver asked. My prison or my freedom, depending on whether the pattern can be completed. Her voice held bitter humor. My parents have chosen well. A duke's second son, impeccable lineage, terrible gambling debts. We're buying blood with silk money, as always. The weaver studied her face, seeing there the kind of resignation he recognized from his own mirror in the months after Catherine's death. And if the pattern isn't completed? Then I remain unmarried, a burden and an embarrassment, but perhaps free to make my own choices. She laughed, short and sharp. You see why my brother hopes you fail? An unmarried sister means more inheritance for him, more funds for his pleasures. Through the workshop window, the October sun was beginning its descent, painting the room in shades of amber. The weaver could hear the distant sound of looms from the district below, that constant heartbeat of industry. Here in this room, suspended between worlds, working class and aristocracy, past and present, superstition and reason, He felt the weight of more than just thread and tradition. The weaver's fourth attempt at the Rose of Avignon pattern began at dawn, where the workshop held that peculiar stillness that came before the house awakened. He had spent the night analyzing the broken threads from his previous attempts, laying them out like evidence of a crime. Each break occurred at precisely the same point in the pattern, when the shuttle speed reached a specific rhythm combined with the petals lifting in the rose's most complex sequence. His fingers worked automatically, years of training allowing his mind to wander while maintaining perfect tension. He thought of Marie Dubois, who had intercepted him yesterday evening with news that seemed casual but carried weight. "I worked in that house once," she had said, pretending to arrange laundry while watching his face. "When I was 15. The old Comte was still alive then." Strange things happened in that workshop wing, especially at night. Now, as the loom clacked its rhythm, the weaver felt it again, that subtle tremor in the floorboards. He stopped immediately, marking the exact point in the pattern. 14 roses complete, beginning the 15th. Always the 15th. Father Bernard arrived as the weaver was examining the floor more carefully, his black cassock incongruous in the silk workshop. At 60, the priest moved with the careful dignity of someone who had learned that rushing rarely improved anything. "The Comte requested I bless the loom," he said, though his eyes held skepticism about the efficacy of holy water against mechanical problems. "Father," the weaver said, continuing his examination, "you've been in this district 40 years. What do you know of this house's construction?" The priest settled himself on a bench with obvious relief. "Built in 1803, on the site of an older manor." The first Comte de Montmorency, Henri's father, insisted on incorporating parts of the original foundation. Pride, you understand, wanted to show his nobility had roots, even if they were purchased roots. The weaver's fingers had found something, a metal ring, barely visible, set into the floorboards. And before the manor? Ah, now that's interesting. A monastery vineyard. The monks of St. Bernard made wine here for 2 centuries. Famous for it, actually. They had extensive cellars, carved from the limestone hill itself. Father Bernard rose, joints protesting, to peer at what the weaver had found. "Is that significant?" Before the weaver could answer, voices rose from the main house, Etienne's sharp tones and another man's lower rumble. Through the window he glimpsed his apprentice, Victor, leaving through the garden gate, walking quickly, shoulders hunched. Etienne stood in the doorway, watching him go with satisfaction on his soft features. "Your apprentice has expensive tastes," Father Bernard observed quietly. "I've seen him at the gaming houses in Terreau. Strange company for a weaver's boy." The metal ring, when pulled, revealed a trapdoor. Steep stairs descended into darkness that smelled of ancient wine and older stone. The weaver lit a lamp, its flame flickering in the cool air that rose from below. The cellar was vast, vaulted ceilings carved with the precision of medieval craftsmen who built for eternity. Empty wine racks lined the walls, and the weaver could see how the workshop above sat directly over the central vault. "Magnificent," Father Bernard breathed, his voice echoing strangely. The echo seemed to linger, bouncing between the stone arches in a way that made the weaver's ears uncomfortable. They climbed back up to find Comtesse Isabelle waiting in the workshop, her composure slightly cracked. "My husband is away on business," she said, though the weaver hadn't asked. "I wanted to speak with you privately about the commission." Father Bernard excused himself with practiced discretion, leaving them alone with the loom standing between them like a confession booth. "My family," the Comtesse began, then stopped, searching for words that maintained dignity while revealing necessity. "We say the pattern is for Claudette's dowry, and it is. But it's more than that. My husband's business ventures have not been successful lately. The marriage must happen, and it must happen properly, with all traditions observed. The Duke's family is very particular about such things." The weaver nodded, understanding more than she was saying. The merchant comte needed his daughter to marry true nobility, to secure the family's social position, even if the financial position was crumbling. And the Rose of Avignon, that cursed pattern, was the key to it all. "There's something else," she continued, her voice dropping. "Etienne owes money. Substantial sums."
To people who don't accept promissory notes from younger sons. If Claudette's marriage doesn't happen, if the dowry isn't paid and reciprocated. She didn't need to finish. The weaver knew how such stories ended: scandal, ruin, sometimes worse. After she left, the weaver returned to the loom, but his mind was on the cellar below. He began another attempt at the pattern, this time counting not just threads and movements, but listening, feeling for the exact moment when the vibration began. There, as the shuttle flew and the beams shifted, he heard it. A low hum, almost below hearing, that seemed to come from the very stones beneath. The threads began their telltale trembling, but this time, instead of stopping, he continued weaving, observing how the vibration intensified with each pass of the shuttle at this particular rhythm. The threads snapped at exactly the 14th rose, as they always did. But now the weaver understood something crucial. He descended again to the cellar, this time with chalk to mark the walls. The vaulted ceiling formed a perfect acoustic chamber, and the workshop sat at its resonant center. When the loom operated at the specific rhythm required for the Rose of Avignon pattern, it created vibrations that the medieval architecture amplified and returned, like a bell struck at precisely its natural frequency. Evening fell as he climbed back to the workshop, his mind already working through solutions. Victor had returned, hovering anxiously at the door. "Master, I need to speak with you." The weaver waited, patient as always with the boy's struggles. "I owe Monsieur Etienne money," Victor said in a rush. "From cards. I thought I could win it back, but he says if you complete the pattern, he'll forgive the debt. If you fail, I must work for him. Leave your workshop." So that was Etienne's game. Sabotage through corruption of the apprentice. The weaver felt a familiar weariness, the kind that came from seeing how readily people sold themselves for the promise of easy solutions. Yet looking at Victor's frightened face, he remembered his own youth, his own mistakes, the masters who had shown patience when he deserved none. The university professor arrived on a gray November morning, his skepticism preceding him like a herald. Professor Duchamp taught natural philosophy and had written papers on the emerging science of acoustics that the weaver had sought out in the municipal library. At 46, he possessed that particular combination of brilliance and impatience that made him equally respected and avoided in academic circles. "A haunted loom," he said, circling the device with the air of someone examining a particularly disappointing student. "And you believe it's a matter of resonance?" The weaver had prepared his demonstration carefully. He began weaving a simple pattern first, the shuttle flying in steady rhythm. Then, gradually, he shifted to the specific tempo required for the Rose of Avignon. As the pattern emerged, he watched the professor's face change from condescension to curiosity. "Listen," the weaver said,
though it was more about feeling than hearing. The vibration built slowly, like water coming to boil. The professor placed his hand on the floor, his eyes widening. Remarkable! The frequency is almost below human perception, what the Germans call Unterschall, infrasound. He produced a notebook, sketching rapidly. The cellar beneath acts as a resonating chamber. But why this specific rhythm? They descended to the cellars together, the professor measuring distances, tapping walls, muttering calculations. The weaver watched him work, appreciating the systematic approach even as he thought about Victor, who had been avoiding the workshop for 2 days since his confession.
The medieval monks were more sophisticated than we credit, Duchamp said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. These proportions aren't accidental. They're based on harmonic ratios, the same mathematics that govern music. When your loom operates at precisely 1/16 of the cellar's fundamental frequency, the resonance amplifies, the weaver finished. Exponentially. The vibration returns to the floor above, creating what physicists call a standing wave. Your threads are literally being shaken apart by sound you can barely hear. That afternoon, Marie Dubois found the weaver in his temporary workroom at the mansion, surrounded by diagrams and calculations. She had brought him bread and cheese, claiming she was passing by, though they both knew her route never came near the hill. "You look like you haven't slept," she observed, setting down the food with the casual authority of someone used to caring for others. "I've been thinking about solutions," he admitted. The professor suggests dampening materials, but that would require rebuilding the floor. The Comte would never agree. Marie studied the loom with surprising intensity. "When I worked here as a girl, the old Comte had a musician friend who visited. He complained that certain rooms were impossible for practicing. The sound would boom and echo strangely. They hung tapestries, laid thick carpets, but nothing worked. What did they do? Changed the music." She smiled at his expression. "If you can't change the room, change what you put into it." That evening, the weaver experimented with different weaving rhythms, trying to find a tempo that would create the rose pattern without triggering the resonance. But the pattern was demanding. Its complexity required precise timing, and any deviation produced flawed fabric. He worked until his fingers cramped, the autumn moon rising and setting as he struggled with the ancient puzzle. Jacques Ferrand appeared near midnight, drawn by the light in the workshop. The weaver's rival and old friend stood in the doorway, his 42 years showing in the lines around his eyes. "Still working? You'll ruin your hands." "Jacques." The weaver didn't look up from his calculations. "Come to gloat?" "To understand." Jacques moved closer, his professional interest overcoming personal animosity. "The whole district is talking. A cursed loom that breaks threads through supernatural means." "Nothing supernatural about it." The weaver explained his discovery, watching Jacques' face shift from skepticism to fascination to something like respect. "Resonance," Jacques repeated slowly. "Like when soldiers break step crossing a bridge." He studied the loom with new eyes. "Could you alter the beta bar's weight?" "Change its natural frequency?" It was a clever suggestion, and the two men spent the next hour discussing modifications, their rivalry temporarily forgotten in the face of an interesting problem. The weaver was reminded of their apprentice days, when competition hadn't yet soured into jealousy. "Why help me?" the weaver asked, finally. Jacques shrugged, uncomfortable with emotional honesty. "Because if you fail, they'll say all Lyon weavers are frauds.
Your reputation is our reputation. He paused at the door, and because Catherine would have wanted me to. The mention of his late wife stopped the weaver's hands. Jacques had been at her funeral, had helped carry the coffin. Before the rivalry, before the jealousy, they had been friends. Alone again, the weaver considered the problem from every angle. The professor's science explained the curse, but solving it required more than understanding. He thought of the monks who had built the cellar, creating their unintended acoustic trap.
He thought of generations of weavers who had failed at this exact spot, their confusion turning to superstition. Near dawn, Claudette found him asleep at the loom, his head resting on his arms. She moved quietly, studying his work, the pages of calculations and diagrams. When he stirred, she was sitting across from him, watching with those intelligent eyes that reminded him of Catherine, not in appearance, but in their refusal to accept easy answers. "You found the cause," she said. It wasn't a question. Finding and fixing are different things. "My engagement party is in 3 weeks," she said quietly. "If the fabric isn't ready, if the dowry is incomplete..." She stood, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly. "My mother doesn't know I've been meeting someone, a silk merchant's son. We've talked about running away, but that's just talk." In reality, there's nowhere to run to, is there? The weaver thought of his own youth, the dreams that had seemed so possible before life revealed its constraints. Comte Henri de Montmorency returned from his business travels on a cold November morning, bringing with him the smell of tobacco and failed negotiations. The weaver, arriving for another day's work, found the household transformed, servants moving with nervous efficiency, voices lowered, the very air charged with tension. The Comte summoned him immediately to the library, where account books lay open like wounds. "I understand you've identified the problem," he said without preamble, his merchant's directness showing through the aristocratic veneer. "The cellars beneath create an acoustic phenomenon. When the loom operates at the rose pattern's required rhythm, resonance develops that vibrates the threads beyond their tolerance." Henri laughed, bitter and short. 3 generations of mystery, and its architecture. He moved to the window, looking down at the city where he'd made his fortune before trying to transform it into birthright. "Can you solve it?" "I'm working on modifications. But, Monsieur le Comte, there's something you should know." The weaver chose his words carefully. "Your son has been interfering with my apprentice, using debt to..." "Etienne's debts are nothing new." The Comte's voice held exhaustion rather than anger. "Do you know what it costs to maintain this fiction of nobility? My father bought this title with silk money, married into authenticity. I've spent my life trying to make it real for my children." The weaver recognized the particular burden of the self-made man, never quite belonging to the world you've entered, no longer fitting in the one you've left. He'd seen it in smaller scale among successful weavers who moved to better districts, always caught between. "The dowry fabric," Henri continued, "isn't just tradition. Claudette's marriage contract contains a clause. If the Rose of Avignon isn't presented, the agreement can be voided. The Duke's family inserted it, knowing our history with the pattern. They expect us to fail." "Why agree to such terms?" "Because even the possibility of this marriage has extended my credit for 6 months. Without it..." He gestured at the account books. "The merchants of Lyon are patient with a future duke's father-in-law. With a failed businessman, less so." Comtesse Isabelle entered without knocking,
a breach of her usual impeccable manners that spoke to the household's distress. "There's been a development," she announced, her composure cracking. "Mother Superior at the convent of St. Bernard has information about the cellars. She requests your presence." The convent sat at the district's edge, a remnant of the old religious order that had once owned these lands.
Mother Superior, ancient at 81, received them in a parlor that smelled of beeswax and centuries of prayer. Her eyes, clouded with cataracts, seemed to see more than they should. "You're investigating the Montmorency cellars," she said, her voice paper-thin but clear. "My predecessor left records you should see." She produced a manuscript, illustrated with architectural drawings. The weaver recognized the cellar vaults immediately, but these plans showed more: additional chambers, sealed passages, and notations in Latin about acoustic properties. "The monks designed it deliberately," Mother Superior explained. "A resonating chamber for their chants. They believed certain frequencies brought one closer to the divine, but they also discovered that other frequencies could cause distress, even madness. They sealed certain chambers to prevent what they called the devil's harmony." "And these sealed chambers?" "Were opened when the first comte built his mansion." He wanted the full extent of the cellars for his wine collection.
She fixed them with those unseeing eyes that saw everything. Pride, as always, preceded the fall. Returning to the mansion, they found chaos. Victor stood in the workshop, blood on his knuckles. Etienne sprawled on the floor, holding his nose. Claudette was there too, her face flushed with anger rather than embarrassment. "He tried to steal the pattern samples," Victor said, breathless. "Said if he destroyed them, you'd have nothing to copy, would have to admit failure." The weaver helped Etienne to his feet, noting how soft living had made the young man weak despite his advantages. Blood stained his expensive shirt, and his eyes held the peculiar combination of rage and fear common to bullies who've been bested. "You'll regret this," Etienne snarled at Victor. "Your debt is cleared," Claudette interrupted. "I've paid it, from my jewelry sales." She turned to the weaver.
"I won't have your work sabotaged by my brother's schemes." The family dynamic shifted visibly, alliances and resentments realigning. Henri looked at his son with disappointment that seemed both fresh and ancient, while Isabelle studied her daughter with new calculation. Victor stammered thanks that Claudette waved away impatiently. That evening the weaver worked alone, processing the day's revelations. The architectural plans from the convent showed a possible solution. If certain passages were reopened, the resonance could be redirected, diffused through multiple chambers rather than concentrated beneath the workshop. But it would require construction, expense, and most importantly, time they didn't have. Marie Dubois arrived with supper and gossip. "The whole district knows about the fight," she said, unpacking bread and stew. "They're saying your apprentice defended the workshop's honor, making him quite the hero among the younger weavers." "Victor's no hero." "He's a boy who made mistakes and is trying to correct them."
"Like all of us, then," Marie's voice held gentle mockery. "Even you, with your scientific explanations and careful distance. You're becoming invested in this family's problems." The weaver wanted to deny it, but she was right. Somewhere between the mystery of the breaking threads and the human drama surrounding them, he'd stopped being merely a hired craftsman. Claudette's trapped desperation, Henri's climbing-falling cycle, even Etienne's poisonous weakness, they'd become more than problems to solve. "Catherine would have liked this puzzle," he said suddenly, surprising himself. Marie smiled, sad and understanding. She would have liked seeing you engaged with life again, instead of just enduring it. As night deepened, the weaver returned to his calculations, but his mind kept returning to the sealed chambers below.
Professor Duchamp arrived at the workshop before dawn, accompanied by 2 students carrying strange instruments. Brass tubes, graduated cylinders, and a device with vibrating metal tines he called a tonometer. The November cold made their breath visible as they worked, setting up their equipment with academic precision. "We map the resonance patterns," Duchamp explained, adjusting his instruments. "Find the dead zones where the sound cancels itself. Basic wave interference, like ripples on a pond meeting each other." The weaver operated the loom while the students took measurements, their faces serious with the importance of applying classroom theory to real problems. One, barely 20, kept stealing glances at the actual silk threads, as if surprised such mundane materials could demonstrate physical principles. "Remarkable," Duchamp muttered, checking his calculations for the 3rd time. "The resonance achieves maximum amplitude at exactly the 15th rose pattern repeat. The medieval builders created an almost perfect harmonic trap." Victor worked alongside them, having thrown himself into the investigation with the fervor of someone seeking redemption. His fight with Etienne had transformed him in the workshop district's eyes from suspected wastrel to defender of craft honor. The weaver noticed how his apprentice stood straighter now, the shame lifting from his shoulders. By midday, they had mapped the entire resonance pattern. The solution, when Duchamp presented it, was elegantly simple and practically impossible. You need to create a counter-rhythm, a second pattern woven simultaneously that produces frequencies to cancel the harmful resonance, like 2 waves meeting to create calm water. 2 patterns at once? On the same loom? The weaver's skepticism was professional. What the professor suggested violated fundamental weaving principles. "Or," Duchamp said slowly, his academic mind pursuing another path, "you could alter the rhythm subtly, varying it enough to prevent standing waves while maintaining pattern integrity. It would require extraordinary skill, changing tempo without changing tension." That afternoon brought unexpected visitors. Jacques Ferrand arrived with 3 other master weavers from the district, their faces grave with collective concern. "We've come to offer assistance," Jacques said formally, though the weaver could see the effort such humility cost him. "The district's reputation?" the weaver asked. "Partly, but also," Jacques paused, choosing words carefully. "What you're attempting here, using science to solve what seemed supernatural, it matters. We spend our lives at the mercy of forces we don't understand. If you can prove that knowledge conquers mystery—" The old philosophical question threading through their practical lives like silk through heddles. The weaver understood. These men had suffered through economic collapses, social upheavals, technological changes that threatened their ancient craft. The idea that understanding could conquer fear, that reason could defeat superstition, it offered hope beyond this single commission. The weavers examined the loom together, 5 masters bringing combined centuries of experience. They debated modifications, tested theories, their competitive edges worn smooth by the shared challenge. One suggested adding weights to dampen vibration. Another proposed altering the beater bar's angle. Each idea was tested, refined, discarded, or incorporated. Marie Dubois brought food for the impromptu gathering.
her presence accepted without question, despite the usual social boundaries. She moved among them with easy authority, and the weaver noticed how naturally she fit into this world of craft and problem-solving. "You've turned this into a guild meeting," she teased, but her eyes showed approval.
As evening approached, Claudette appeared in the doorway. The master weavers straightened, suddenly aware of their work clothes in the presence of nobility. But she entered without ceremony, examining their modifications with genuine interest.
"My grandmother would have appreciated this," she said quietly. "She believed in progress through understanding." "Mademoiselle," Jacques ventured carefully, "your situation, the deadline." 10 days until the engagement party," she confirmed. "Either the fabric is ready, or—" She shrugged with practiced indifference that fooled no one. After the others departed, the weaver remained with Victor, testing their modifications. They had developed a technique, varying the shuttle speed in a pattern that seemed random but was actually mathematically calculated to disrupt resonance formation. It required intense concentration and perfect timing.
"Master," Victor said suddenly, "I need to tell you something more about Monsieur Etienne." The weaver waited, patient as always. "He wasn't just collecting my gambling debts. He's been selling information about his father's business troubles. There are creditors circling, waiting for the engagement to fail so they can demand immediate payment." The web of connections revealed itself. Etienne sabotaging his own family, creditors gambling on social failure, Claudette's marriage as the pin holding everything in place. The weaver thought about the old monks and their acoustic chambers, how they'd tried to encode divine harmony into stone. Humans, it seemed, were better at creating discord. That night he began weaving with the new technique. The shuttle flew in its calculated irregular pattern, fast, slow, medium, slow, fast, a rhythm that felt wrong to his trained hands, but produced no resonance. The roses began to bloom in silk, one after another, past the cursed 15th, into the 16th, 17th. Then, at the 20th rose, his concentration slipped for just a moment. The rhythm regularized, the resonance built, and 3 threads snapped like gunshots in the quiet workshop. He stared at the broken threads, understanding the challenge fully now. The solution existed, but it required superhuman concentration for the hours needed to complete the full fabric. One moment's inattention would destroy everything. Through the window, the lights of Lyon spread below like earthbound stars, each one representing a workshop, a family, a story of struggle and small triumph. The solution came to the weaver at 3 in the morning, 5 days before the engagement party, as he sat watching his mother sleep in the chair she'd pulled into the workshop. She'd arrived unannounced that evening, bringing soup and stubbornness in equal measure, declaring she wouldn't leave until he'd eaten properly. "You're killing yourself over silk," she'd said, but her eyes showed understanding. She knew what it meant to pour your soul into thread, to find meaning in the intersection of warp and weft. Now, watching her lined face in the lamplight, he realized what had been nagging at him. The monks hadn't failed. They'd succeeded. The resonance chamber was designed to make certain activities impossible, to force contemplation over action. The breaking threads weren't a flaw, but a feature, preventing the creation of patterns that encoded meanings the Church found heretical. The Rose of Avignon wasn't just beautiful. It was a Protestant symbol, woven by Huguenot refugees who'd fled to Switzerland. The Catholic monks who'd owned this land would have known.
would have specifically designed their chambers to prevent its creation.
The curse wasn't supernatural or accidental. It was architectural warfare, frozen in stone and time. Morning brought crisis. Comte Henri stood in the workshop, his merchant's composure finally cracked. "The creditors know," he said simply, "about the incomplete fabric, about Etienne's betrayals. They're demanding surety by tomorrow or they'll call in everything." Behind him, Comtesse Isabelle held herself rigid, breeding and training the only things keeping her upright. Claudette stood apart, her face carved from marble, already practicing for a future she didn't want. "I can complete it," the weaver said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "But not here. The loom must be moved." "Moved? That's impossible. It weighs—" "Then we work around the resonance." The weaver's mind raced through possibilities. "We need musicians, many of them, to create competing frequencies that will mask the destructive resonance." It was Victor who understood first. Like a choir singing over a single wrong note, the harmony drowns out the discord. The weaver nodded, already calculating. 20 musicians at least, playing or singing at specific frequencies. Professor Duchamp can calculate the exact notes needed. What followed was controlled chaos. Jacques Ferrand, summoned by urgent message, arrived with fellow weavers who could also play instruments. The working class of Lyon had their own musical traditions. Marie Dubois brought her cousins, all singers from the textile factories where work songs made the labor bearable. Father Bernard contributed the church choir, amused by the theological irony of Catholics helping create a Protestant pattern. Professor Duchamp worked feverishly, calculating frequencies, assigning notes, creating what he called an acoustic shield. By evening, the workshop overflowed with people, workers and aristocrats, believers and skeptics, all united in this strange moment of cooperation. "This is madness," Etienne said from the doorway, his face twisted with disbelief and something else. Fear, perhaps, at seeing his sabotage transformed into solidarity. "This is community," Father Bernard corrected gently. "Something you might understand if you hadn't spent so much time believing you were above it." The weaving began at sunset. The weaver sat at the loom, hands steady, breath controlled. Around him, the musicians formed concentric circles. As the shuttle began its rhythm, they sang, not a religious hymn or work song, but something Duchamp had composed specifically, notes calculated to create interference patterns with the cellar's resonance. The roses began to bloom in silk. 1, 2, 3. The weaver's hands moved in the modified rhythm, while around him voices rose and fell in calculated harmony. 10, 11, 12. His mother watched from her chair, tears on her cheeks, though whether from pride or memory he couldn't tell. 15, the cursed number. The building trembled slightly, the resonance trying to form, but the voices adjusted, following Duchamp's conducting, and the vibration dissipated into harmless noise. 16, 17. Claudette had moved closer, watching the pattern emerge with intensity that had nothing to do with dowries or marriages. She was seeing possibility, that curses could be broken not through magic or resignation, but through understanding and collective will. 25 roses, 30. The weaver's arms ached, his concentration absolute. Around him, voices grew hoarse, but no one stopped. Marie Dubois caught his eye,
smiled encouragement. Jacques Ferrand, his rivalry forgotten, watched with professional admiration as the fabric grew. At the 40th rose, halfway through, Etienne made his move. Whether from spite or desperation, he grabbed for the fabric, trying to tear what had been completed. But Victor was ready, had been watching, and caught his arm. The two young men struggled briefly before others intervened, pulling Etienne away. "You're destroying everything," Etienne shouted at his father. "Spending fortunes on marriage that will make us all prisoners to convention." Henri looked at his son with sadness deeper than anger. "We're already prisoners. I'm trying to negotiate better terms." The weaving continued. 50 roses, 60. The pattern was more than halfway complete when the weaver felt his concentration slipping. His hands, after hours of precise movement, began to cramp. The modified rhythm, so unnatural to his trained muscles, fought against decades of habit. It was Victor who stepped forward. "Master, let me continue. You've taught me the rhythm." The weaver wanted to refuse. This was his commission, his responsibility. But looking at his apprentice's determined face, he saw something of himself 20 years ago, eager to prove worthiness through skill. He rose, Victor taking his place smoothly, the rhythm continuing without pause. The completed fabric lay across the examination table like captured moonlight, its roses seeming to pulse with life in the morning sun. The weaver ran his fingers along the silk, feeling for imperfections that weren't there. 72 roses, perfect in their complexity, created by the hands of 2 craftsmen and the voices of a community. The engagement party was that evening, and the Montmorency mansion hummed with preparation. Servants polished silver that would be sold next month to pay debts, arranged flowers that cost more than a weaver's weekly wage, pretended not to notice the tension that made every conversation feel like flint striking steel. Comtesse Isabelle examined the fabric with the intensity of someone looking for salvation in silk. "It's more beautiful than the original," she said quietly. "How?" "The original was made in fear," the weaver replied. "This was made in cooperation." She smiled, sad and knowing. "You're a philosopher as well as a craftsman." "All craftsmen are philosophers, madam. We just express our thoughts through our hands." The Duke's family would arrive at 4, bringing with them lawyers and documents, traditions and traps. The fabric would be presented, examined, validated by experts brought specifically to find fault. The weaver had been asked to remain, to defend his work if challenged. He found Claudette in the garden, staring at the dormant rose bushes with the blank expression of someone practicing absence. "It's beautiful fabric," she said without turning. "Shame it's being used to purchase my imprisonment." "Or your freedom," the weaver suggested carefully. She laughed, bitter as winter wine. "Freedom? I'll exchange one cage for another, my father's house for my husband's. At least here I know the dimensions of my cell." Before he could respond, a commotion arose from the house. Etienne had returned. He disappeared after his attempted sabotage, bringing with him 3 men whose clothing suggested wealth without taste, whose bearing suggested violence without conscience. Creditors, but not the patient kind who accepted promissory notes. "The party's off," Etienne announced loudly, wine heavy on his breath, though it was barely noon. "These gentlemen have prior claims that must be settled immediately." Henri emerged, his face gray. "The engagement party is this evening. After that—" "Now," one of the creditors interrupted. "Your son owes us considerable sums. He offered information about your business as collateral, but that information proved outdated. So we require immediate payment or equivalent value." The weaver understood suddenly. Etienne hadn't just sabotaged the fabric, he'd sabotaged everything, selling false information to dangerous men, creating debts that would destroy the family regardless of Claudette's marriage.
"How much?" Henri asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would be ruinous. The sum named would have bought 3 workshops in Croix-Rousse. Etienne smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally found a way to wound his father fatally. It was Victor who spoke up, surprising everyone. "Monsieur Etienne owes me as well. A debt of honor from when I saved him from accusations of cheating at cards last month." The apprentice produced a paper from his pocket. "His written acknowledgement." The creditors examined the document with professional interest. One laughed. "You saved this fool from being exposed as a cheat? And he gave you a marker for it?" "I thought he might reform," Victor said simply. "I was wrong." What followed was negotiation of a different kind. The creditors, it turned out, had their own code. Etienne had been cheating them while cheating at cards, selling them false information while owing them true money. The debt of honor Victor held, witnessed, signed, legally binding, gave him standing to make a proposal. "The fabric," Victor said, indicating the Rose of Avignon. "It's worth more than you might think, not just as dowry, but as proof of possibility. The pattern that couldn't be woven, conquered by Lyon craftsmen. Every noble family with a difficult commission will want the weavers who achieved this." The lead creditor studied the fabric with new interest. "And you propose?" "A partnership. The Montmorency name, cleansed of debt, promoting Lyon silk to the nobility. Comte Henri's connections, my master's skill, the story of the cursed pattern defeated. Worth more in future profits than current debts." The weaver watched his apprentice with amazement. Victor had learned more than weaving these past months. He'd learned to see patterns beyond thread, to understand how commerce and craft intersected. The creditors withdrew to discuss. Henry looked at his son with exhaustion deeper than anger. "Why?" he asked simply. Etienne's facade cracked slightly. "Because you bought your way into their world, but you'll never belong. Neither will I. At least Claudette might escape through marriage. I'm trapped here, neither merchant nor noble, nothing but a badly played role." Father Bernard had arrived for the party preparations and heard this last exchange. "Young man," he said gently, "you're not trapped by your birth, but by your choices. Your father built something from nothing. You've chosen to destroy rather than create. That's not fate. It's decision." The creditors returned with their verdict. They would accept the partnership proposal with conditions. The workshop would produce 3 major commissions yearly for clients they provided. The Montmorency name would guarantee the work, and Etienne would be barred from any involvement in family finances. "Agreed," Henri said immediately, relief visible in the loosening of his shoulders. The engagement party proceeded as planned. The Duke's family arrived precisely at 4, their carriages black as judgment, their faces composed in expressions of perpetual evaluation. The fabric was presented with appropriate ceremony, examined by their expert, an elderly woman from Paris who handled it with reverent fingers. "Extraordinary," she pronounced. "The pattern is perfect, but more than that, the story it tells.
Cooperation overcoming curse, science defeating superstition. Very modern, very French. The marriage contract was signed as the sun set, painting the workshop where it had all begun, in shades of gold and rose. January of 1844 arrived with unusual warmth, as if winter itself had decided to break with tradition. The weaver sat in his workshop in Croix, the familiar clatter of looms from neighboring shops creating the district's eternal symphony.
3 months had passed since the night of voices and roses, since the curse had been revealed as mere physics, and the solution found in community. His mother worked quietly nearby, preparing silk for the next commission. Another noble family had heard of the Rose of Avignon triumph and wanted their own impossible pattern made possible. At 62, her fingers remained sure, her eyes sharp for imperfection. "Marie Dubois asked after you again," she mentioned casually, though nothing his mother did was ever truly casual. "Marie asks after everyone," the weaver replied, adjusting the tension on his loom. "It's her nature." His mother's single sound contained entire conversations about loneliness, second chances, and the wisdom of accepting kindness when offered. Victor had grown into his mastery these past months. The partnership he'd negotiated had proven profitable for all parties. The creditors discovered that investing in craft yielded better returns than extracting payment through threat, while the Montmorency name, attached to genuine quality rather than purchased prestige, had recovered some of its luster. The apprentice, though he was truly a journeyman now, had developed a talent for seeing the patterns that connected commerce and craft, understanding how reputation could be woven as surely as silk. "Master," Victor said now, entering with correspondence, "a letter from Mademoiselle Claudette." The weaver opened it carefully. Claudette's marriage had proceeded as contracted, but her letter suggested something unexpected, not happiness exactly, but a kind of interested engagement with her new life. Her husband, it seemed, shared her interest in natural philosophy. They were establishing a salon in Paris, where artists and scientists might meet, where patterns of thought could intersect like warp and weft. "I think often of that night," she wrote, "when the whole district came together to break a curse that wasn't a curse. You taught me something valuable, that understanding the mechanism doesn't diminish the mystery. It simply reveals a deeper pattern. My husband and I are applying this principle to our marriage. Rather than accepting the traditional patterns, we're weaving our own." The weaver smiled. Perhaps her cage had become a loom, transforming confinement into creation. Jacques Ferrand appeared in the doorway, his rivalry transformed over these months into something more complex. Not quite friendship, but professional respect seasoned with shared history. "The guild meets tonight," he said. "They want you to present your acoustic discoveries. Professor Duchamp will attend." The guild meetings had changed since the Rose of Avignon event. Where once they'd focused solely on thread counts and pricing disputes, now they included discussions of new techniques, scientific principles, the ways tradition and innovation might strengthen each other rather than compete. "I'll be there," the weaver agreed. After Jacques left, the weaver returned to his work, but his mind wandered to philosophical paths. The curse of the Montmorency loom had been real. Threads had broken, patterns had failed, families had suffered. That the cause was resonance rather than supernatural intervention didn't make the effects less genuine. Knowledge had provided the solution, but it was human cooperation that had implemented it.
Father Bernard visited that afternoon, as had become his custom. The priest enjoyed watching the weaver work, finding in the rhythmic motion something meditative, almost prayer-like. "I've been thinking about that night," he said, settling his bulk onto the reinforced stool kept specifically for his visits. "We sang hymns to defeat a Protestant pattern. There's a lesson there about the foolishness of old divisions." "Or about the power of harmony over discord," the weaver suggested. "That too." Father Bernard produced a small flask, offering it to the weaver. Good wine, probably from the Montmorency cellars that had caused so much trouble. "Comte Henri sends his regards, by the way. The partnership is exceeding expectations. He's even found a position for Etienne, managing a vineyard in the south, far from cards and creditors. And far from temptation? We can only hope. Though I suspect the vines will either cure him or reveal him completely. Nature has a way of showing us who we really are." As evening approached, Marie Dubois arrived with dinner, as had become her habit these past weeks. She no longer pretended she was just passing by, and the weaver no longer pretended not to expect her. His mother excused herself with transparent diplomacy, claiming fatigue that fooled no one. "You're different," Marie observed, serving the soup she'd brought. "Since the Montmorency Commission, less distant." The weaver considered this. "I spent 3 years believing Catherine's death was my fault, that I'd worked too much, noticed too little, failed to see her illness until too late. The curse of the loom taught me something. Sometimes things break not through malice or negligence, but because of patterns we don't understand. Understanding doesn't eliminate the pain, but it allows us to move forward." Marie reached across the small table, taking his hand. Her fingers were rough from lie and labor, honest hands that had never pretended to be other than they were. "Catherine wouldn't want you locked in the past," she said gently. "No," the weaver agreed. "She believed in patterns that evolved, adapted." She would have loved the solution to the rose, all those voices creating something together that none could achieve alone. Later, walking to the guild meeting through streets silvered by moonlight, the weaver thought about the threads that connected past and future, tradition and innovation, loss and possibility. The Rose of Avignon pattern, born from religious conflict, preserved through stubborn tradition, nearly lost to acoustic coincidence, had been saved by cooperation between old rivals, different classes, competing philosophies. The guild hall was full when he arrived, masters and journeymen, even some apprentices brave enough to attend. Professor Duchamp had brought his diagrams, his calculations, his infectious enthusiasm for revealing the world's hidden mechanisms. The weaver began his presentation, explaining resonance and interference, showing how medieval architecture had accidentally created an acoustic trap that centuries of superstition had transformed into a curse.
But as he spoke, he realized he was telling a larger story about how knowledge and tradition need not be enemies, how understanding mechanisms deepened rather than diminished wonder, how the most complex patterns emerged from simple rules repeated with variation. The weavers listened with the attention of people recognizing their own lives in abstract principles, seeing their daily work elevated to philosophy. The meeting continued late into the night, questions and discussions weaving their own pattern of understanding. The weaver participated, but also observed, seeing how the guild itself was changing, adapting to new times while preserving ancient knowledge. Like a fabric where old techniques met new designs, creating something neither traditional nor modern,
but simply beautiful. Walking home through empty streets, the weaver felt a contentment he hadn't known in years.
Not happiness exactly. That would come later, slowly, carefully woven through days with Marie, conversations with Victor, the gradual rebuilding of a life nearly torn apart by grief. But contentment, yes. The deep satisfaction of understanding one's place in the pattern, of being both thread and weaver in the endless fabric of human connection. The workshop waited, silent in the darkness, tomorrow's work already warped on the loom. There would be other commissions, other challenges, other patterns that seemed impossible until knowledge and cooperation revealed the way forward. But tonight, in the January warmth that shouldn't exist but did, the weaver simply stood at his window, looking out over the sleeping district, listening to the city breathe, feeling himself part of something larger, a pattern that included cursed looms and broken hearts, acoustic physics and ancient superstitions, individual threads, and the fabric they created together. The Rose of Avignon was complete. Its curse broken not by magic, but by understanding. And in that understanding, the weaver had found something he hadn't known he was seeking. Not just the solution to a technical problem, but a way forward from grief, a pattern for living that honored the past while embracing the future. The threads of his life, once broken, had been rewoven into something different, but still beautiful, still strong, still capable of creating roses from mere silk and human will.